Thank you so much for sitting down with us today, Charles.
Oh, you're welcome.
So we like to start just by getting a bit of background information. So our first question is, what was your name at birth?
My name at birth was Charles Floyd Johnson.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And when and where were you born?
I was born, think about this, February 12th, 1941, Camden, New Jersey.
And did you grow up there as well?
No, I lived in Camden from the time until I was about 2. And then my family moved to Delaware. My mother was an educator, so she moved, got a job teaching in the state of Delaware. And my father was a civil servant at that time, and he took a job there too, and so we moved there, and that's where I grew up.
And tell us a little bit about your childhood. What were some of your interests?
Well, growing up, I was one of those very active children. I did almost everything. My mother was a teacher, so I was into every activity you could think. I took piano as a child from the age of 7, and then I ended up playing for the Sunday school. I ended up playing for the church. I don't think that well, but I did play. I was in the band. I was always kind of one of these people who acted in plays, even as a child, as 7, 8, 9, 10. At that time, rock and roll was a big thing, or rhythm and blues. I even sang in a group where we would go around and sing, rhythm and blues, rock and roll songs. And I was the leader, but again, I don't think I was that good at it, but I did it. And then when I was about 14 or 15, my parents decided to send me away to boarding school. And I went to a school in New York called the Stony Brook College Preparatory. And at that time, which was about 1959, I was the only one of 2 African American students at the school. And that's where I ended up getting my high school diploma from Stony Brook, and then I went on to college from there.
So what was that experience like for you, being one of the only African Americans there?
You know, it was an interesting experience in the sense that I think my parents were really extraordinary people, and they prepared me well for all kinds of things. And so I sort of looked at life as just, going to that school as I was just going to be one of the students, and I was. And I didn't have any kind of problem with racism. I mean, I'm sure it was probably there. This is 1958, 59. But I just went through as if I were one of the students. I was in everything you could think of. I was an editor of the yearbook. I was on the student council, and I was, I think, vice president of my class one year and secretary another year. So, and we were in a group called the King's Men, and it was a glee club. And I was the only African American in the group, and there were about 16 of us, and we traveled all around the New York, New Jersey area, Connecticut, singing. I just loved it. I did very well there. And the headmaster, I remember, when I left school to go off to college, said to my mother and father, Charles learned a lot here, but we learned a lot from Charles. So I was very proud of my time there. And I go back there occasionally and give back to Stony Brook.
And at that time, did you know what you wanted to be?
It's interesting, Adrian. I always wanted to be somehow in the entertainment industry. Don't ask me where it came from. I came from a little town called Middletown, Delaware, in a very small state. I don't know where it came from, but when I was about 8 or 9 years old, we had one theater in the town. It was a theater called the Everett Theater. I remember it well because years later, when they did Dead Poets Society, they shot it near my little town, and they used the theater for that theater scene in Dead Poets Society. That's where I would go and see movies. And it was a segregated theater.
Oh, wow.
And I used to have to sit with the other African Americans. At that time, we were probably colored or Negro. We used to sit in the balcony on one side of the theater. But I would go. My parents wouldn't go to that theater because it wasn't something they wanted to do. But kids would go because it was the only game in town in terms of being able to have entertainment. And I would go there and I'd watch films. Early on, I was watching those serials, and at that time it was serials like the Superman and Roy Rogers and Dale Evans and things like that. But around, I would say, the mid-50s, I was still going to that theater before I'd gone off to school in New York. And Sidney Poitier had just made his debut in films and things like Blackboard Jungle and whatever. And there was a film around 1952, 53, 54, something like that, with Dorothy Dandridge called Carmen Jones. And I remember watching those people and watching those images and going, I don't know how, but I want to do what they do. And I was probably from the age of like 7 or 8 or 9 on. But life took a turn before I ever got to start that career, but that's where it started.
So it sounds like there were some powerful film influences. What about television, too?
Oh, well, that's an interesting story, too, because I had not only wonderful parents who were professionals, but they were also very entrepreneurial. And they started a soda shop in Middletown, in an old building where they carved it out and made a soda shop. And I remember years later thinking, our soda shop looked like the soda shop in Happy Days. Seriously, it had those checkered tablecloths and the soda fountain and all, and it was a segregated community. So my parents had the first television in the neighborhood in the soda shop, and we would then go and everybody would watch television there, especially on the weekends. But when there was a fight, like Joe Louis was big at that time, and the other fighters, the community would come in and watch television. So I got my first television influences very early on there. So I had the movie experiences, but television was right there. And I remember somehow when the people would come and watch, there was a show called, Ed Sullivan had a show called Toast of the Town. Later it was called the Ed Sullivan Show, but early on. And he would always have performers of color. So it would be like, in those days you had what was called like the party line telephones. So if Pearl Bailey, who was often on Toast of the Town, was on, I remember people calling each other on the party line saying, go down to the soda shop, Pearlie Mae's on Ed Sullivan tonight. And so those were some of my early influences. I watched a lot of those early shows there. And so I watched those performers. And I don't know, I always felt like I wanted to do what they did. I didn't know how, but I just thought, they have an impact because they reach people. And of course, I wasn't seeing the behind the scenes because I didn't know anything about that. But the performers were there, and that was great. I have a great story I love in that one of the performers in the movie Carmen Jones, and I was probably maybe 12 or 13 or something when that came on, was Brock Peters. And Brock Peters was in that film as the tough sergeant who liked Carmen Jones and whatever. And I remember liking him. Well, years later, when I came to Hollywood, Brock Peters became one of my best friends. And I ended up, before Brock died, I was doing a series called Jag. And I was able to hire him as actually, it was his very last film or television work. But it was that full circle that came from the days I watched him in the balcony of the Everett Theater, and then met him here, became friendly. Both Ann and I became very friendly with he and his wife. And then I was on a board of a program he had for minority students. And I did a show years later called Voices of Our People, in which Brock was one of the performers, as was I. And we won a couple local Emmys for it. So that's a very interesting story coming from the days of watching him in that theater and then in the movie theater and then hiring him for his very last show.
Yeah. So it sounds like you had this kind of real desire to be in entertainment. So when you got to college, did you pursue that?
I did. The very first thing I did when I went to college at Howard, right out of Stony Brook, the very first thing I did was seek out the theater department. But my parents didn't want me to be in the entertainment business, not because they were so against it. They just didn't feel, they knew nothing about it. They knew nobody in it. And being an educator, my mother's going, you got to get a solid education, you know, whatever. So, but they weren't opposed to my acting in theater. They just didn't feel like I could major in theater or any of that. So I actually, when I decided to get a major, ended up in political science and history and a minor in education because that's what I knew. But I did lots of plays in college from the time I was a freshman until I was about a junior. And then I stopped because I had to kind of buckle down and finish to get out of school. But I was in the Howard Players, which was a very well-known group that Roxy Roker did when she was at Howard, and Ossie Davis did when he was at Howard. So I have that, and lots of friends today who I knew in college who were in theater together. But I didn't pursue it in terms of a major, but I did do quite a bit of work. And when I left, this is an interesting story, when I left Howard to start a life after college, I had decided somehow that I was going to go to the neighborhood playhouse and study under Sanford Meisner. And my mother and father were not very happy about that. And my grandfather used to always say, that young man likes to talk, he's going to be a lawyer. So that was sort of the family mantra. And I announced to my mother and father that I was going to go to New York. And my mother said, well, you really shouldn't do that. And she said the blow of things that I've never forgotten. She said to me, darling, I've seen you on stage. I love you, but Sidney Poitier, you're not. And so they made a bargain. I joked with them when they were around that we made a Faustian bargain because my mother and father said, look, tell you what, let me go to law school. And they got me to apply to Howard Law School. I didn't apply anyplace else because I wasn't that anxious to go. Go to law school and take it as a winter resort. And if you don't like it, then we'll support you, whatever you want to do. But they were smarter, I think, than I was because I did go to law school at Howard. I did do all 3 years. I became a member of the Law Journal. I graduated 5th in my class. And I finished 3 years. So I think they were just kind of smarter than I was in terms of that because I was thinking I'll do 6 months out and I'll be in New York. So that was it. And then I finished that, and the Vietnam War came, and orders came for me to go to the military, and that was where what I did next.
So did you go to Vietnam?
No, but I almost did. I got orders to go to the military, and I went in. I had actually just finished law school, had taken the bar, but hadn't gotten results for passing it, and I went to basic training, and then to what they call OJT, which is kind of an job training for classification for a clerk in the military, because I had the law degree, so they were like, maybe you can be a clerk. And I got sent to Fort Dix, New Jersey, to work for something called Courts and Boards, which is a part of the staff judge advocate in the Army, because it was perfect matching. And while I was there, I got orders eventually to go to Vietnam. But I had a very interesting, enterprising mother. And she got a hold of the governor of the state, which was a small state, and my mother was a Republican at that time. And she got a hold of the governor of the state, and suddenly, before I got to go to Vietnam, my orders got changed.
Wow.
And I stayed at Fort Dix, New Jersey for the 2 years, the remaining part of the 2 years I was in the Army. But interestingly enough, at that time, I was running the staff judge advocate's office as an administrator, sort of all the clerical stuff and the administration stuff that goes along with that office. And there were so many AWOL cases that came through the New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware corridor that they needed help with people defending clients. Well, the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, allows you to defend clients if they request you, even if you don't have a law degree, even if you're not an officer. So I ended up going and defending something like 300 and some young men who were for different cases. Sometimes they weren't all AWOL, sometimes they were minor things. And I would go to the stockade with the lieutenants and captains I was working with. I think I was a specialist fifth class. Now, I could have become an officer, but it required 2 more years. I was not interested in that. And so I ended my time getting a Army Commendation Medal for defending a lot of court-martial cases.
I mean, did you enjoy practicing law? Sounds like you did it for your parents a little bit.
I did it for my parents and more for my family, because when I got out of the military, I went to work in Washington, D.C. as a lawyer for the government. I had a job as an attorney advisor for the United States Copyright Office. And I didn't have to, I was sort of a person who advised on cases, but I didn't have to go in the courtroom. Although I was a member of the U.S. District Court Bar and the D.C. Bar, I didn't have to do a lot of practicing. I did work for a short while before I came to California when I was in the government for about 3 years. And when I got ready to decide that I was going to come to California, because that's interesting, that 3 years I was in the government, I was pretty much spending my evenings and weekends in theater again. If you could look at my history of acting, I did a lot of community plays, a lot of plays at local theaters. I did local television in D.C. I was in a U.S. Postal film where I was one of the supervisors in a film. I did lots of little things like that. So by the time I got to 3 years in the government, I was like, my avocation was becoming, pretty much something I was going to do. In the Copyright Office, we would get Variety and the Reporter. It would come through because all the copies every day had to come through. And I started to see them, and I would read about things in Hollywood, and I would read about classes that you could take or schools you could go to. And I sort of made a decision. I was about 28 years old, and I went, I don't want to be 30 years old and doing this. I want to be doing what I really want to do. And so I found a school that was in Los Angeles called Professional Theater Workshop. It was on El Centro and Santa Monica Boulevard, run by a man named Tony Barr, who was a former actor and was a CBS executive who ran the school. On top of it all, because I had been in the military, I had the GI Bill. So they took the GI Bill. So I sort of applied to go there and got accepted and made the decision that I wanted to go and come to California. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know what was going to be. I was either New York or California. But the thing about it was I thought if I'm going to go and be an actor, if I'm going to starve, I'd rather do it in a warmer climate. So California sort of became that. And that's what I did. I eventually left. But I did go to work for a law firm in Wilmington, Delaware for about 4 months before I came out here because I needed extra money. And as a lawyer, I knew from my community, and I went to work for him. And I did some practicing actually in the courtroom for about that. But it was not something I loved because I think my head was always in being in entertainment. And the only thing I knew right then was being an actor. So, but before I got to California, I did one other thing, which is kind of an interesting aspect of my life. I was doing something with the Copyright Office, and as it turned out, we did a copyright convention at the U.S. State Department. And I was assigned to one of the justices of the Supreme Court of Sweden. And I was with him for an entire week. And at the end of the week, he said to me, "Charles, have you ever been to Sweden?" And I said, "No." He said, "Would you like to come?" I said, "Well, it sounds very interesting." He said, "Well, if you can get your agency to find something that we can work on together with the U.S. Copyright Office and with the copyright auspices in Sweden, I think I can get you a grant to come." So I went back to my office. We worked it out. I got the grant from Stockholm, from the Swedish Ministry of Justice, and I went off to Sweden for a few months before I came to California. And before I got to, this is how life is very strange. Before I left Europe, the U.S. Copyright Office called me and said there was a UNESCO copyright convention in Paris, since you're in Europe already, it's easier for us to send you over there than it is to send somebody from home. So we're sending you to Paris to this UNESCO convention. While I was at UNESCO for 2 or 3 weeks before I came home, a job opened up in the copyright division at UNESCO. And I thought, oh my God, to live in Paris and learn French, this would be great. So I applied for the job and I got it. But I was nearing that 29, 30-year mark, and I went, I can always go back to Paris, but you're only 30 once. So I turned the job down, and the young woman who got it was eternally grateful. And I got in my car, and I drove with a friend to LA, and the rest is history.
And have you since been to Paris?
Many, many times. When I was working on the Rockford Files, David Chase, who I had the good fortune of working with him, became a Francophile. And so he and Mita Rosenberg and I would go, whenever we could, off to Paris. In fact, we were all together one hiatus. I think I've been to Paris maybe 20 times since then.
Wow.
Yeah. In fact, once Anne and I went to Paris, and I said, we're always staying in hotels, so we rented an apartment on the left bank for 2 weeks and then an apartment on the right bank. And we were right in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower, so every night we could see that. So it was like fun because it was like, I'm actually living here. Mm-hmm. So that's great, yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
All right, so now we're out in California.
Yeah.
Tell us about life when you got there.
Well, I didn't know anybody, but I did have a school to go to. I found a little apartment in Hollywood near the school, and I went to class 4 days a week. And then on the 5th day, they taught you had to go learn to get pictures and resumes and go try to find agents. And so I did that for about, Adrian, maybe about 9-10 months. And then I thought I was kind of running out of money. And I got to find something else to do. And so I ended up I was doing a play at the workshop. And one of the actresses in the play's husband was working at Universal Studios. And he was in the mailroom, but had left the mailroom to go into business affairs. And I was telling my friend Connie Bryant Milton that I needed a job, and I didn't want to necessarily wait tables or work retail. And she said, well, you know, Richard Milton, her husband, just got out of the mailroom, and he's in business affairs. You ought to go out and have lunch with him. So she arranged it, and I had lunch with him. And I had a law degree, and he got me an application. I remember that. He got me a chance to interview for the mailroom, but they didn't want to hire me because I had a law degree, and they said, "You're not going to stay in the mailroom. You're going to be in here for 5 minutes, and you're gone." But I harangued them, and I sort of kept calling them, and eventually a place opened up, and one day the phone rang, and they said, "Come to the mailroom." Now, this is the interesting story about my time in the mailroom at Universal. I was only in the mailroom 3 days. And that was just an amazing thing, because what happened was Richard was in the business affairs department, my friend who got me the interview, and he was talking to his boss, and a slot had just opened up just about the time I went in the mailroom in their department. And he mentioned to his boss that I was there and I had a law degree. And it didn't hurt that I was a minority, because this was like the early 70s, and the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, was pressing studios to hire more people of color behind the camera. There weren't a lot at that time. There were some, but not a lot. And so I got a call the second day in the mailroom that to go interview with Paul Miller, who was the head of that department. And it was a nice interview, but I didn't think I was going to get the job. And I was in the commissary at the Universal. This is all of about 3 days. And literally, the guy in the labor relations, or whatever that is, human resources, saw me in the commissary in the line. He says, "I hear you're moving up." And I was going, "What?" And I was so nervous, I didn't even ask. I said, "Oh, okay." I went back to the mailroom, and they were all angry because they had all heard I was leaving. And that was it. I went to business affairs at Universal in 1974.
And what did you do for business affairs?
Well, that was amazing. Universal at the time was, that was the time when Universal and Warner Brothers had tons of television. Universal was doing tons of movies of the week. They were doing lots of series. They must have had 16 or 17 hours of television. So the business affairs department where we were called production coordinators. And we would get assigned to different shows where we would do things like we would work on clearances for shows. We'd go to dailies to look for problems that existed in the dailies. We would work on trying to find directors for shows, writers for shows. We would make do the contracts for them. They were all kind of simplified things. But because I had a law degree, it was perfect for me, they thought. And I then ended up on a show. One of the earliest shows I worked on was a show called Night Gallery. Night Gallery was the show that Rod Serling created, but they would use original stories. So I got assigned to that, where I would go in and work on contracts for the original stories and work on that kind of thing. But I also got assigned to work with a show called The Rockford Files, a show called, I can't remember all the show called Toma, and many other things. And we would work with the producers of the shows. And at that time, there were tons of producers at Universal who were doing television. And they were all often receptive to working with their coordinators, because the coordinating department at that time was known as a place where you could move up. So some of us moved into writing, some of us moved into directing, some of us moved into producing. Some moved into being executives in studios, but a lot of us moved up. And it just took time to do it. And it was a great learning experience. I got to go take the rough cuts to the network. At that time, we would do that and hear the notes and then bring them back to the producers. I'd get to go on dubbing stages and scoring stages and follow your shows all the way through. It was an amazing learning experience. But the great thing was that when I got assigned to the Rockford Files, a man named Roy Huggins was then the executive producer of the Rockford Files along with Mita Rosenberg. And I had worked early on Toma, which was Roy Huggins' show, Alias Smith and Jones, which was a Roy Huggins show, and I was assigned to all of Roy's shows. And Roy loved to be pedagogic, so I could sometimes go over and I'd sit on story conferences, and I couldn't say anything, but I learned. And Roy loved to do that. And one of the people that was under Roy on Toma was Stephen Cannell, and then later Juanita Bartlett, and those people were people who were my friends and at that time my supervisors, but we became colleagues and whatever. So that's how I started out, and I learned so much because of Roy's guidance and Stephen, who we were close in age, but Stephen was already a kind of shining star as a writer on Universal's lot, and he got assigned to write the pilot for Rockford. And I was still the production coordinator on that show. But I would say shortly after, in the first year of that show, there was an internecine warfare between Mita Rosenberg and Roy Huggins. And Roy had worked with Jim Garner on the early Mavericks, but Mita was Jim's manager and agent who had become the executive producer, and they did not get along. So Roy departed, and all of the people who Roy had hired, a couple of the producers left. One of the people who left was the associate producer. So I'm still in the production coordination department as their production coordinator. And literally, the phone rang one day, and it was Mita and Steve. And they were now running the show, and Roy had sort of stepped back. And they said, "Come down and talk to us." And I went down, and they said, "How would you like to be our associate producer?" Well, the interesting thing about the story is that I had still been pursuing acting on the side. And you weren't allowed to act and work in production. SAG didn't really allow it, and the studios didn't allow it, but I did. And I had a couple of roles on Toma, which I was also a production coordinator on. I did a $6 Million Man. I did a Kojak at that time with Telly Savalas. And the interesting thing about the Kojak was it was one of Sylvester Stallone's first roles, and I played a young cop who replaced him. So I was acting at the same time. So when they offered me the associate producer job, I was going, well, I'm just starting to also act, and that's what I really wanted to do. But they said, think about it, and I went home by myself, and I thought about it, and I thought, you can always act probably, but you're not going to be offered every day a chance to be an associate producer. And so I opted to take the job, and that was the beginning of a long career in 1974 as the associate producer on the Rockford Files.
And at that time, were you familiar with what an associate producer did?
Not really.
So
I wasn't familiar at all with what an associate producer did. I sort of had some idea because as a production coordinator, you could observe some of the things, but I didn't really know what they did, and so. But these were people who were willing to trust me and let me learn on the job. I later found out, Adrian, an interesting story that Mita Rosenberg's assistant, Marianne Ray, who's a dear, dear friend of mine, when they were talking about hiring somebody to become the associate producer, she heard the conversation, and later she told me that she said to Mita, "Have you ever thought about Charles?" And she said, that's where the genesis of the idea of calling me down. So I'm eternally grateful to her, but they also liked me because they knew who I was. And this time, there were almost no associate producers who were of color on the lot. Later on, there were a couple of others who joined me, my friend Arnold Turner and a woman named Yvonne Demery, who became associate producers for a short while. But it was sort of a new trailblazing position, and I learned on the job. But there were lots of people willing to help. Even a funny story on the dubbing stage when I first had to go, because you start out mainly doing a lot of post-production, which is what I learned to do. But I didn't know what really mixing was on a stage. So I used to pay attention by looking at the mixers in the panel, and we'd be going through a sequence, and I would watch their faces, and if something like seemed to bother them, I'd go, "Can we stop?" I wasn't sure what it was. And they said, "What's the matter, Charles? Is it so-and-so?" I said, "Yeah, that's..." And you just learn that way, and but they were willing to help. And I had lots of people like sound mixers and other people who just sort of brought me along. And so it was a very happy time to learn.
And did you spend much time on set as well?
Oh, yeah. Well, that was one of the joys. And then being on sets was like, being on sets at that time I was just in heaven. Because I suppose there was a little star and starless and wonderless that you had because of all these things growing up as a child. So I was able to go on stages, and Universal just had tons of production. So I spent a lot of time just going down and visiting. You got to know the actors, you got to know the producers and the directors, because some of them you had made contracts for to whatever. People like John Badham, Juno Swark, or directing television at that time, Richard Donner. Even Steven Spielberg was just getting out of television and starting more to do. I don't even think he had done his first feature when I got to the lot. He may have done Duel, and Sugarland Express came shortly afterwards. But he was there too, so it was an amazing time in that sense. So I did spend time on sets, and I did a little acting even when I was an associate producer for a while. But there came a time when I would get parts, instead of being a day part, it would be 3 and 4 days, and then you'd have to be gone. And it was like, are you a production coordinator or associate producer, or are you an actor? And so I sort of gave it up after that. But I would sometimes go to dailies and see some of my friends who I'd gone to acting school with, in 1 or 2 little parts in the dailies, and I'd go, "What's wrong with this picture? I want to be up there and not down here in the seats." But I lost that soon.
So tell us a little bit about working with Mita and Steven.
Working with Mita and Steven, Mita Rosenberg and Stephen Cannell was, I think one of the pretty great training grounds you could ever have. Mita Rosenberg was a character. She was. I think I was in fear of her when I first started working with her. She'd been around for a long time. She started as a very young woman as I think a story editor at MGM or someplace. And she married later a guy named George Rosenberg. She was Mita Reese first, and then she was Mita Reese Rosenberg. And they had one of the most successful agencies in the business. And they represented, beside Jim Garner, Robert Redford, and tons of people. So she was pretty strong. And she was she was one of those women, I think, who grew up where you had to be tough. And I used to see her sort of take stances, and I would sometimes go into Mita's office, and I'd my knees would be shaking. I eventually learned, I got past that. But she was a great role model. And Cannell, Stephen Cannell, not only became my boss and my mentor, but then my friend. We were close in age. And he was the most giving and the most loving and kind, generous man. One of my favorites in the business. We became friends. Our birthdays were close together. I was the 12th of February and he was the 5th. And we'd celebrate them kind of together. And he encouraged me when I was doing a lot of associate producing and post-production. I wanted to become more creative in the producing area. So he encouraged me to try and write. And I got several writing story assignments on Rockford where I got into the Writers Guild, and that helped my profile so that I could move on. And Steve was always there to say, whatever you want to do. One of my great stories about Cannell was before I had decided to definitely become in the producing arena, I was thinking one day, just maybe I should go try acting for a while and then go back. And he was so kind to me. He said, you know, I'll support you in whatever you want to do. And if you need money, I'll give you $25,000 and you can have that to start with and you pay me back whenever. I never took him up on it, but that's who Stephen was. And in the end, when David Chase came on, David Chase was the story editor at the time on another show. I can't remember what show it was. And it was with Darren McGavin, but I think it was Night something. And David was the story editor on Rockford, and I was the associate producer. And after 2 years, David was so good as a writer that they decided to move him up to be a producer. But at that time, it was only David Chase, Steve Cannell, Nita Rosenberg. We didn't have hordes of producers at that time, and Juanita Bartlett, who was our story editor. And that was our team. And they decided, Mita and Steve, that they did not want to make David a producer without making me a producer. So David and I became producers at the same time on that show. And that was who they were, because they were very nurturing. And we were all together for 5.5, almost 6 seasons on that show. When David came on shortly after I did. Eventually Juanita Bartlett became one of the producers as well. And we were just a great group of people, but I couldn't have had better supporters and colleagues who helped me move along.
So how did your role change when you went from associate producer to producer?
When I moved from being an associate producer to a producer, I moved sort of out of the post-production area and more into the day-to-day supervisorial aspects of the show. So I sat in on story conferences more. I got to deal with kind of overseeing the post-production, the editing, the looping and all that, but I didn't have to do the grunt work. I used to have to do lots of inserts. I didn't do those anymore. And I became more or less the day-to-day administrator of the show, because the other people were all writers and producers, and they had to write scripts. And this Mita, not Mita so much. Mita didn't write much. She did do some directing, but David and Juanita and Steve wrote most of our scripts. So I got to be the person who did the daily administrative work, and then I would confer with them later in terms of what we're doing and how we were doing it. And then I got to confer a lot with the actors and with Jim Garner. And so I learned a lot about moving up as a producer in terms of how to oversee the entire production, and that was very different from just being in the niche of doing post-production. And I got to learn to work with crews, and but I had a safety net there, because whenever I was in trouble, I could go in. We were all in the same little space, and I could go in the Mita's office or Steve's office or David's office, Juanita's, and work out things when I was there. It didn't later on when I moved on. I didn't quite have that safety net, but then I did. After it was 1974 when I went on as associate producer, became producer in '76, and then in '78 we won the Emmy for the best drama that year, and that was really something. So I look back very fondly of those days, and now only David and I are around. Mita's gone, Steve's gone, Jim's gone, Juanita's gone, but David and I are still around, and we talk on occasion. And I was so proud of him when he did Sopranos and many other things that he did. He had a great career.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about working with Jim Gardner.
Working with Jim Gardner, that's I think of it with such fondness because he was extraordinary he was fun as an actor. He was so good at what he did because he made it look easy. You know, there are people out there who do that, and Jim was one of those. I worked with Carol Burnett later, and she did, you know, she was the same way. Not as regular on her, but I later worked with Carol on Magnum. But Jim was just giving, and he cared so much about his crew. And he would support the crew, the writers. He was very good to the writers, even if the script wasn't so good. He said those words. He didn't change them. He supported them whatever they wanted to do. I learned a lot about how shows are run through how Jim treated the overall process in terms of what the show meant to him, what the crew meant to him, and how you support people, and how you give a great esprit de corps for the unit. And I think I've been on a lot of units since then, but I learned a lot from that experience with Garner. Interestingly enough, as the years went on, I became a very good friend of Jim. Ann and I spent time with he and Lois personally and privately. Sometimes Jim would call up and say, "You guys want to go to dinner?" And my wife and Lois Garner were progressives, I would say, very liberal. So their politics were the same. I think that may have bound us a little bit. But I later ended up not only working with Jim on Rockford, but then there was a little show that came along. There was a reprise of Brett Maverick at Warner Brothers. I did that with him. Mita went over to Warner Brothers and called me, and I did that. I later did the Rockford movies we did in the 90s. We did 8 of them, and so I went back to work with Jim, and Rita Moreno came back, and Steve and David and Juanita, we were all there. Is that okay?
Should we just wait for a few minutes?
I think Ann's going to pick it up. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Continue.
So I remember doing those movies, and then I later a show came along called First Monday, and it was about the Supreme Court, and we wanted Jim Garner to play the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he did, and so that became my 4th time working with Jim, and through all those years. And interestingly enough, when I was on NCIS years later, and they all said, "You know Jim Garner," and we were looking for a man to play Jim Garner's, Mark Harmon Gibbs' character's father. And they said, "You know, go see if he wants to do it." So I called him up, and actually he came in. The network came up, ponied up with money for him, and he came to the read-through, and we hadn't seen each other in a while, and hey, he gave me a big hug in front of everybody. He said, "Oh, we better get a room," you know, kind of thing. It was so cute. And then he went home and had a heart attack.
Oh.
He had done wardrobe and all of that, done the read-through, and he never got to do the role. But we later hired Ralph Waite to do that role. But that was the story. But that was I had a long career from 1974 when I first met Garner till he passed. We were very close, and I had great respect for him, and he was a great liberal, so that worked for me.
And I mean, he was basically in every scene of Rockford Files.
He was in every. Yeah. You know, he was the goal of that show. He was the heart of that show, and so he was in everything. And he had a bad knees and a bad back. He'd been in Korea, and I think he had gotten injured or something, and he ran all the time in that show. It was Rockford was always chasing someone, and he was always getting into fights. And Jim liked to do the fights. He liked to do the driving. So by the time we got to the 5th season of that show, he was having a pretty rough time of it. So we began the sixth season, but he didn't get through it all. I think we did about half year of the sixth season, and he sort of lost it and went down on it. But he worked very hard on it, and it was because he was. There are not many actors who can do the drama as well as the humor. He could do both. And you look at his work, and you would think, well, he's not working very hard at it, but that's how good he was. But I would see him sitting in the set with the script, working on it. But by the time it was on its feet and going, it's like you and I are talking. He was just that good at it. I got to meet a lot of people through him and through that show. Lots of wonderful people over the years, and one of the people I worked with over the years was Lauren Bacall, who came onto the show and did a 2-hour for us, and and there were many others that along the way, James Coburn and all people. I didn't become very friendly with Betty Bacall, as everybody calls her, because she lived in New York, but I got to spend time with her when she was doing the show. But I did get to James Coburn directed the show, and then he and I and Anne became friendly after that. So it's a very interesting life we have in terms of that kind of thing.
Yeah, there were some great guest stars on Rockford.
Oh, yeah.
Isaac Hayes,
Rita
Moreno.
Yeah, Rita, and they were both recurs, and Lauren Bacall and so many others. I can't remember. It was a glorious show, and a lot of people wanted to work with Jim. So Lou Gossett came on, and they had done a movie called The Skin Game. And I actually wrote one of the stories for one of the episodes that Lou did. Yeah.
Did you ever write any of the answering machine messages?
Oh, it's funny that you asked that. Yes, I did. I ended up having to do a bulk of those near the end.
Oh, yeah.
The writers used to do them, but when they got so busy, it then suddenly became Charles would do them. So I think I may have done 200 of those. I don't know how many. I did a lot of them, and that was fun to do. Yeah.
Were there ever any issues with standards and practices or content at all?
With standards and practices, yeah, there probably were. It's been so long ago, I've probably forgotten them. Things were very different then, and what you could do and what you couldn't do on television. But I don't know of anything so outstanding that it rings to this day. But remember, that was probably 45 years ago. So my memory dims on those.
And you mentioned you won the Emmy in 1978.
Yeah.
Did you attend the ceremony?
Oh, yeah. That we all gathered together before we went to, I guess it's the Pasadena Civic Auditorium. And it wasn't my first Emmy ceremony because we had been nominated before. So I had been once or twice before. But it was pretty special because I didn't think we were going to win. And I was sitting in the row with Mita and Steve and David and Juanita. And when they called and said it was the Rockford Files was the winner, and they all got up and started streaming down the aisle, and I was still sitting in my seat. I don't think it had hit me. And then suddenly Juanita, who wasn't producing yet, pushed me out down the aisle. And I remember standing on stage with the Emmy in my hand saying, "You have to pry this from my cold dead hands. I'm not letting it go." I was so proud.
And then the show did come to an end in
Yes.
1980. What were some of your biggest takeaways from your first time producing on that show?
Takeaways from producing was learning what producing really meant. Because producing is one of those things where I think everybody thinks like acting, you can do it. And it isn't so simple because there's so many facets of it. I really had to learn what was involved in the show in terms of the different departments, department heads, budgets, how they ran, the network and studio input into those shows, getting it on the air, commercial integration, which we didn't have to do so much, but we had to be concerned with how to do that. The timing of shows, casting, location scouting, all of those things, components of a show, I didn't really know. So, but once you've been on a show that runs as long as it does, as long as a show like Rockford ran, and that was my first long-running show, you begin to absorb that, and you begin to understand what the process is about, and then you learn how to be what doing a good show, and how to make them last and durable through the process. So I think I cut my basic eye teeth on that show, learning the elements of production, and most of all, learning how to nurture a crew, work with a crew, inspire the crew. I learned that I didn't have to know exactly as much as the production designer or the location manager, but I did have to learn to appreciate what that job was, what it entailed, and how to help them get there. So it was. I think it was a great education.
For a second. Okay. And then what do you think the legacy of the Rockford Files is?
The legacy of the Rockford Files is humor. I think that it was a show that used the talents of Jim Garner to show that you could do a dramatic hour of television, but it didn't have to be, strum and drang. It didn't have to be dour. And audiences could come to like it for the integration of the drama and the humor. And I think it was one of the earlier shows that did that. But it had a unique star who could pull that off. And there were other shows like Kojak and Hawaii Five-0 and all those shows with Beretta and Toma and on and on and on, who didn't have that combination of humor and drama. And the interesting thing, Adrian, is that over the years, I ended up doing shows that had that element. To this day, NCIS does the same thing. In different ways, but it has that ability to combine the humor and the drama. Yeah. And I think that may have really been my, the legacy of that show may have been my ticket to continue to work on shows similar.
Mm-hmm. And you stayed at Universal for a while, right?
Yes, I was at Universal from 1971 to 1980, maybe even 81. Because after Rockford went down, Universal kept me on. I was very surprised and very happy because I had worked with the same unit. But they liked me well enough, I don't know what it is, that they picked up my contract. And then I ended up working on a few projects like Movies of the Week there before I went over to Warner Brothers on Brett Maverick. I actually did the pilot of Simon & Simon. There were two of those, and I did the second one, and the second one sold. Mm-hmm. And I worked for Phil DeGuerre on that, and that was interesting because when you asked me about what I did on the Rockford Files and what I learned, when I got appointed to Simon & Simon, Phil DeGuerre was writing a couple of other pilots at the same time, and I was the only producer with him. He was the exec producer, and we had an associate. And suddenly, we were going to shoot the show in San Diego as well as L.A. And suddenly I had been on location with Rockford, but I had a great supporting team. And we'd shot in Hawaii and we'd shot in other places with Rockford. But I was now taking a full crew to San Diego and to Mexico, to Ensenada, Tijuana. And I was like it. Now I had enough building blocks that I was able to do that. But then when I went over into Tijuana and Ensenada, and we were only supposed to take a skeleton crew, but I worked with a Mexican supervisor who worked with us, who helped me, and I went over and we got the show shot, and it was all me. I had to do it, and Phil DeGuerre was writing. He was in L.A., and I had to get that show done. And but I learned, I got it done, and we came back, and I have a great story quickly about that show. Oh no, actually, it's another show. I'm confusing. But anyway, I did Simon & Simon, and it sold, and then I did Hellinger's Law, which was a successor to Kojak, but this time Telly was playing a Philadelphia lawyer. It didn't sell. I did a couple other projects for Universal, and then the phone rang, and Mita had gone to Warner Brothers, And she said, "What are you doing over there?" And I said, "Well, they got me working on different projects. Well, Jim and I want you to come over to Warner Brothers and do Brett Maverick." And so I left Universal for the first time and went to Warner Brothers for a year. And we didn't. That show didn't stay on. It was a fun show, and Jim did it well. But the demographics were not quite what NBC wanted, and we were down to the wire. We had finished the first year, and and Warner Brothers had spent some money to remodel the sets for the next year. And at the upfronts, and after it was announced we were not on the schedule, it was a big shock. And so I didn't stay on that. And then within a few months, Universal called me and said they're having trouble on Magnum PI. It had just started up, and they had already been on the air, I think, 2 seasons. And but they said we'd like you to come over and talk to Don Belisario. Now this is where life is very serendipitous. One of the assistants on that show was my first assistant on the Rockford Files. And she said to Don Belisario when they were having trouble with that show, and they were shooting in Hawaii, but the other part of the unit was here in LA, she said, "You should get Charles Johnson on the show." So the phone rang, and it was Don Belisario, and he said, "Has Universal called you about coming over here to work on Magnum?" I said, "No, nobody's called." "Well, they should. I want you on my show." And I had actually met Don when he was a writer on Baba Black Sheep, which Steve was doing at the same time we were doing the Rockford Files. And as a matter of fact, I did the pilot of Baba Black Sheep with Cannell, and I was the only producer. Later, the director got a producing credit, Russ Mayberry, but it was just Cannell and myself. But Don later became, when in the series, a writer on the show, and that's how I had met him, but never worked with him. And I was confusing this because when we were doing Baba Black Sheep, I somehow ended up having to take the film to New York, because then we would take it and it was in the film reels, and they had to get it to show the next morning. So I took a red eye with the film in hand to New York, and I sat around in one of the rooms at the MCA while they screened the film, and I got on the elevator, and I don't forget who the executives were at the time when we showed Baba Black Sheep, but I got on the elevator, and they had just come out of the screening, and I was only going to another floor, but they were talking about how much they liked Baba Black Sheep. And so when the fluoride punch came, I didn't get off. I just stayed on the elevator, and I went up to the top floor where they were going, and they all looked at me kind of strange. But they pretty much said they wanted to buy the show. So I got on the phone and called Don Sipes, who was then the head of television for Universal. I think you got the sale. And he said, "Why?" And I told him the story. And later when I got back to LA, he said, "You were right. You know, we got a call shortly after that they bought the show." So that was an interesting, diversion about that show.
Mm-hmm. So we've been talking about an hour. Do you want to take a break, or should we
I'm
keep
good.
going? Okay, great.
If you're good. You're
Yeah.
good.
So let's keep going with Magnum then. So Don Belisario calls you.
So Don Belisario calls me, and I go, and Don Belisario had an interesting history because he was a wonderful creator. He created a lot of shows, but he was a tough producer to work with. And I was a little nervous because several people had gone on that show and they didn't last. So when he called me, I said, "Well, I'm happy to come work, but I don't want to get fired shortly after I'm on the show. So maybe I should just come on as a consultant." And he said, "No, I want you on as a producer." And so we worked it out, and I came on, but I was only going to be the producer in LA. The company was shooting in Honolulu. And so I worked for about 2 or 3 months, sort of trying to get the show more coordinated together, because Don was then doing other shows as well. He was doing a show called The Airwolf, Tales of the Gold Monkey, and so he was pretty busy, and so I became sort of his emissary. But interestingly enough, about 3 months into the show, they said, "You should go to Hawaii. You should at least meet all the crew and the people over there." So I went to Hawaii with Betty McCart, who was Tom Selleck's agent, and Robert Harris, who was the head of television at the time. And while we were there, the producer of the show, Doug Green, who had done Hawaii Five-0, left the show, and I'm never quite sure how all that happened. So they said to me while I'm there for a week, will you stay and work on the show here until we can find a replacement? And I was single then. Ann and I were dating, and she lived in one place and I lived in another. And I called her and I said, I'm going to stay here. Could you go to my house and she had the key to my house and pack up some things and send them because I'm going to be here. And so she did, and I went. And of course, I never came home. And that's how I started I started working here for 3 or 4 months, and then I was there, and I became the producer in Hawaii, and I was there for 6 years of the 8-year run.
So did you make some changes when you first came on?
You know, that was the thing about the show. It was tough when you're doing a show, and you know, this is before computers were big. This was before cell phones. This was before even fax machines. So we were doing the show where the show was being written here, but if there were changes that needed to be made, they had to be sent out to LAX, put on the last plane to Hawaii so they would arrive the next morning, and sometimes they didn't. It was very problematic. And you know, shows make changes all the time, and there were no writers over there. There was a unit manager and a producer, and that was it. So one of the things I did was, and this is maybe self-protection, is that I said after a few months, we have to have a writer over here. It's just difficult. I said, you know, I can go on the set and talk to Tom and the other actors about what they want, and then I got to get on the phone and talk to the writers. But the writers sometimes go, well, what do they really want? And you know, because sometimes the actors what they wanted was maybe intangible or hard to kind of quantify. And so I said, can we get a writer? At least if you send them over for their show, so they can prep it over here and shoot it over here, and then they come home and the next one comes. And they agreed to that. And that helped us enormously, because then, you know, the writing was not so hard to do when changes were made. We didn't have that last plane thing. That helped a lot. And then I had to learn to work on location. I had always worked on the lot, on the set with the people but now I was it. I was the only producer I had a couple of unit managers, and had to work with a crew that was foreign. That was, you know, that I'd never met before. And you're in a local culture, so you had to learn that. So that was, I think, and then I had to learn to work with the actors. I had met Tom Selleck. He had done a couple of iconic roles on The Rocker Files. Lance White. And I had met him when he'd done that, and literally been in the looping room a couple times. But I didn't know him well, but he knew who I was. And so when they told him I was going to stay, he was fine with it. And like Jim Garner, I became a very, very close friend of Selleck over the years. And we worked a lot together after that. But as it turned out, I finished the first year that I was over there. And then I said to them, I have an idea. Let's hire a writer to be on the show all the time. Not the writer of the episode, but a writer who's here with me. And they agreed to that. And my friend Chris Abbott, who had been on Little House on the Prairie before that in Cagney and Lacey, came over, and she and I became the on-set producers. I think she was hired as a story editor, and then she became a producer with me, and we were there. And then I still had every writer come over every show. So we not only had the resident writer, but we had the writer of the episode. It helped enormously in terms of the running of the show, and it cut down that. Eventually, computers started coming in a little bit during that time, and fax machines. And so that sort of changed things a lot too, and then helped enormously. But when I first started, that was all kind of new. It's interesting how things changed over the years. Mm-hmm. And I think I got along very well with Tom, with John Hillerman, Roger Mosley, and Larry Minetti, who were the cast. And I learned that I had to work with the cast and the production there, and also the people in LA, in Los Angeles. But I had great training from my years on the Rockford Files, and learning to work. And then you had a similar thing with the nature of what the show was. Tom had great humor too. And so we again had that drama with the humor and that followed through from my days as whatever. And I think that's maybe, when I talked about that, Adrian, I think that's why maybe I ended up, because of all the other things, being a choice, because they were looking for one of the Rockford writers to come on to Magnum. But Cannell had then started his own company. And David was off doing other things, and Juanita went to work with Cannell. So there were none of that core staff was available except me. But of course there was the serendipitous thing of my assistant working with Don knowing me, and having met Tom, and all of that sort of work. So I think my life up to this point and ever since has been a matter of a lot of serendipity.
Well, you had done some writing on Rockford,
Yes.
right? And you did a little writing for
I did
Magnum
a little writing
as well.
on Magnum. I did one of the episodes I did on Magnum was a show called Limbo, which was the last show that was supposed to be the end of that show. And Tom and I, with Chris, wrote that story for that show. And I did other shows. I did a show with Leslie Uggams. I did several. Most of my writing in the early years was on Rockford and on Magnum. But I was very happy to do that, because one of the things that I felt like I was certainly considered a line producer and a creative producer, but I wasn't one who had created a show. And so everything I could do along the lines of kind of doing more of the creative writing and whatever helped me in terms of moving along in my career and being considered more than sort of a journeyman producer, which I was happy to move on.
Limbo was an interesting episode
Yeah.
because Magnum basically dies. So it was supposed to be a series finale at one
Well,
point?
it was. We actually thought that Limbo was going to be the end of Magnum. We had prepared that he was going to go off to heaven and never come back. But there was that great desire to not end the show. And so we had to find a way to resuscitate him, and the life went on. But it was a very interesting show. We had that great John Denver song in that show. It's a wonderful episode, and I was very happy to have worked on it, to have been part of creating it, and also seeing Magnum live another day.
Yeah. Another episode that gets talked about a lot is Did You See the Sunrise?
Yeah.
Which I think was your first episode.
It was my first episode on the show. I hadn't been on the show more than maybe 2 or 3 episodes or 4 episodes, whatever. That was an interesting thing when you ask about network situations. That show almost didn't make air because it was considered that Magnum shot Ivan when Ivan was in the back.
Yeah.
And there was great uproar on I think it almost didn't air. The sponsors pulled out. But Don Belisario, I must say, loved to kind of push the envelope. And that was, I think, one of Tom's favorite shows, Don's favorite shows. And it ended up being sort of an iconic show for the series. But Magnum was so interesting also because Don created a show about the Vietnam vet coming home. And it was a show where he made them not be people who were totally dysfunctional, which a lot of times episodes and series treated the Vietnam vet as being full of PTSD and not being able to operate. And these were people who had been in the military, had been in the war and been in combat, who came home and were functioning very well. I think one of the greatest things, we'll talk about legacies for Magnum, is that when we ended the show, the Smithsonian called and said that they liked the show, they loved the treatment of how the Vietnam veteran had been portrayed, and they invited us to come to Washington, D.C. and bring Magnum's shirt, ring, hat, whatever we took. And Chris Abbott and Tom Selleck and I went with a couple of the Universal producers to the Smithsonian. We had a great ceremony, and that stuff goes on display and whatever, and it's in the collection. But it was primarily because of the way the show portrayed the veterans and in a positive light.
There were also a couple of crossover episodes with Simon and Simon and Murder, She Wrote.
Murder, She Wrote. That was interesting. I have to tell you that what was fun to do those because I had done Simon and Simon, so it was fun to be able to do a crossover with that show and the producers and the actors I'd worked with, and then we did the Murder, She Wrote crossover because Murder, She Wrote was such a huge show at that time. But it sparked an interesting thing. Angela Lansbury was a wonderful, wonderful actress, and she was probably in her 60s when she did Murder, She Wrote. And Angela had, I think, a 12-hour day, but she did not want to work a minute past 12 hours. And she wasn't a big fan of Hawaii. So the crossover was not something she kind of wanted to do. But she was a team player. And so she came to Hawaii, she did the episode, and one night we couldn't finish the work in 12 hours, but it was the last day. And her producers who were over there couldn't be found. And I remember Jessica Walter, Dorothy Loudon, Stephanie Farrisee. It was a fun episode. We're all in the show, and we had to finish. So I went up to Ms. Lansbury, and I said, we've got another hour to go, and I know it's past your time, but what do we do? She was not a happy camper. And she bit her lip and she said to me, all right, well, if we have to do it, we have to do it. And she did. You could cut the tension on the set with a knife, but she did it. And the next day, I ordered 2, and she then had to go on and do the Murder, She Wrote aspect where Tom came to her show. So she still had that to do. So the next day, I ordered 2 or 3 dozen roses, and I sent them to her hotel, and I wrote a lovely note to her thanking her for, her kindness and what she did. And she wrote me a sweet note back I've never forgotten where she said, we had to get the work done. We did it. And thank you very much. And I never forgot that.
That's great.
Because she was and is still a major trooper. And I was glad to have met her. But that episode sparked interest in the show, and they wanted us then to do an Equalizer crossover. And we just really couldn't get it done that year because it was just, the crossovers take a lot because you have to work. Equalizer was in New York and Murder, She Wrote was in L.A. and so we just couldn't do it. And I think that year we may have also done Frank Sinatra.
Yeah.
So that was another really interesting aspect, and it was Frank's last dramatic role. I think he may have done a little part on Who's the Boss before he died, but Magnum was he was there for 7 days, and that was a huge aspect to get that done.
Did he request to be on the show, or did you guys ask him?
You know how it happened? He was on the show. I think Larry Minetti's father knew Sinatra, and I think, if I recall, I'm not sure of this, Selleck and Minetti ran into Sinatra in a private airport, and Sinatra said, "I want to do your show," and they didn't really believe him. But later on, they came back and mentioned it, and we said, well, let's try it. And we started to negotiate it, and he was very, very important in the process. Kitty Kelly had just done her book, which was not very nice about him. And so he came over, and I think he was really trying to combat that whole image of what she had written in the book. So he was a pretty cooperative guy during that time. And he actually was wearing a colostomy bag during the time, and yet went through that episode amazingly well. Barbara came over. We spent more money flying him over on a private jet from Palm Springs to Hawaii and back than we did probably in what he did made for the episode. But it was an amazing time, and it was one of our more well publicized shows. And getting to work with Sinatra was terrific. One of my favorite stories is he didn't like to work at night, and we had a scene to do one night, and Chris Abbott and I had to go over and talk to him. And I got Chris to go with me to talk because I think he liked her better than he did me. At least that was my perception. And we got him to go, and he came and worked, and they had a dolly shot that night, and they couldn't get it, and they kept missing the shot, and he wanted to get out of there, and he said, "Who the hell is on that dolly? Stevie Wonder?" But we got through it, and when he left on the private plane, I was so happy that we had gotten through it all. But it was a fun episode.
So why did the show come to an end then after 8 seasons?
Well, Magnum came to an end after 8 seasons simply because I think Tom Selleck's feature career was heating up. He had done, I believe, Three Men and a Baby. He'd done High Road to China. He'd done Lassiter. And then Disney made a deal with him, I think, for the sequel to Three Men and a Baby. And I think Tom was getting a lot of feature offers. And he used to say, I'm not tired of the show, but I'm tired from it. And I think he wanted to go on and get new ground. So I think it ended simply because there were more things to do out there. Mm-hmm. It could have certainly gone on for another year or 2 or 3, who knows. But it came to an end. And I was pretty unhappy because shows like that, it's my second show that I had was long run. Forged another relationship with a well-known, wonderful actor and a wonderful cast. And so I was pretty sad when it ended, but I understood that all good things come to an end. But my time with Tom didn't come to an end because Tom asked Chris Abbott and myself to join him in his production company that he had with Universal and one that he had with Disney. And so I went to work with Tom, and we did several projects after that. So I was with Tom from 1980, late 82 until 1993.
So before we leave Magnum, we have to talk about the finale and the identity of Robin Masters because the finale just toys with us.
Yes, it does.
Is it Higgins? Was Higgins Robin Masters?
It's an interesting question about who was Robin Masters. I don't think we ever answered it. I think we left it up in the air. I think you could assume that Higgins may have been Robin Masters, but then maybe not. I think we decided to just leave it as whatever you want to think. I personally think he was not. I think there was an actual Robin Masters. And I love the fact that Don got Orson Welles to do the voice of Robin Masters for many years. That was kind of fun. But we just sort of, it was one of those things. I think David Chase did something like that on Sopranos, where you just don't answer all the questions, but you sort of like leave it up in the air. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's when I think I personally think Robin was someone else, but who knows?
I mean, the show was quite popular in its day. And
oh gosh, yes.
It went up against Cosby Show for a while.
For a while, yeah. We were, before Cosby came on, we were in the top 3 for a year or 2, and then Cosby came on, and it sort of took away some of our thunder. But it was still a very popular show. And then we got moved away from Cosby, and none of us knew how big Bill Cosby was going to be. But of course, he turned out to be a huge show. But it was a pretty popular show because it had a charming. It had good writing, and it had a charming star, and had that great Hawaii locale and whatever. And Tom Selleck for the ladies was not hard to look at. Mm-hmm. So it was pretty fun. I was very lucky and fortunate to be on it.
As a producer, did you follow ratings pretty closely, or how much attention did you pay to all that?
As a producer, yes, I did follow ratings because it meant whether or not you were going to have any longevity, and it meant how successful you were in terms of license fees and what you could get, and so yeah, I followed ratings all the time, and both on Rockford, and in the days of Rockford, there were only like 3 or 4 networks, so 30 and 40 shares we were used to that, 25, 30, 40 shares. Even on Magnum, that was some of the case. But they were very important in that day and age. Things have changed. Again, the landscape has changed so much that, and there's such a huge diversity of shows out there that the ratings are not quite what they used to be. But in the old days, they were the be-all and end-all. And I couldn't wait till the next day to find out what the numbers were. But I think we all did as producers.
Why don't we stop there and take a short break?
Sure.
Perfect.
Thank you.